Well, the air we breathe is free, but some say it could come at a price. We're talking about the statewide impact of air quality today on Nevada Week.
Support for Nevada Week is provided by Senator William H. Hernstat, Cashman Equipment, and additional supporting sponsors.
2020 is an election year. One of the largest focuses of this political season thus far is climate change. Here in Nevada, water, lands, and air quality are all on the top of voters' minds. On this episode of Nevada Week, we're discussing local and national policy to regulate air quality, plus informing voters about both parties' proposals to address climate. Joining us for this conversation is Patrick Donnelly, Nevada State Director of the Center for Biological Diversity; Jackie Choclas, environmental justice organizer with Plan Action and one of the founding members of the Nevada Climate Justice Coalition; Rita Ransom, volunteer for the Citizens Climate Lobby; Greg Lovato, administrator for the Nevada Division of Environmental Protection.
Well, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. Patrick, I want to start with you, and we're talking more just global and domestic level. What is science and research really telling us are the biggest short and long-term effects of air quality?
Well, I think when we're looking at air quality, we really need to start with our climate. The emissions that we're producing are causing a climate crisis, and this is playing out all across the globe. I think your viewers don't need to be reminded of what's happening in Australia right now with the catastrophic wildfires. And here in Las Vegas, we're experiencing it ourselves with the highest temperature increase of any city in the country. We're at 5.7 degrees Fahrenheit, so that's a lot warmer than I think folks who grew up in Las Vegas remember it being here. And our water supply is also threatened by this acute increase in temperatures caused by human activity. And so I think the climate crisis is really dominating this political season because so much is at risk in our world.
Now, Rita, let's talk more about, in addition to climate, public health is another big concern here as well. What are some of the major one of the major health concerns related to air quality as well?
Air quality is a huge factor in Nevadans' health, and our increasing temperatures are increasing what is known as ground level ozone and particulates, which have a particularly difficult effect on most people, especially those who are extremely vulnerable, like the elderly, those who are in lower socioeconomic situations, and others. And doctors here in Nevada are seeing an increase in hospitalizations due to poor air quality. And they're seeing an increase in other kinds of ailments that normally we would not find in Nevada. For example, Zika virus, dengue fever, and other types of diseases that are associated with hotter climates. And that has increased hospitalizations. Asthma has become an increase that's exponential in our state. So we are definitely seeing those kinds of effects.
Now, Jackie, more related to public health as well, we have a lot of not only Democratic presidential candidates, but a lot of our local government is talking about environmental justice related to this too. Particularly, what is environmental justice?
Yeah, so environmental justice is when environmental factors such as the air that we all breathe and the water that we all drink impact communities disproportionately. So when we're talking about environmental justice and air quality, kind of piggybacking off of what Rita said, rates of childhood asthma are significantly higher in communities of color and marginalized communities.
What's the cause of that? Why would we have a more low, moderate income populations that are potentially experiencing these health concerns more than the general public?
I think for that, you can kind of look at historically where, highway corridors are placed, where higher density traffic areas are placed within the community, resulting in more ozone and emissions, being more dense in those communities, and where kind of heavier polluting industries are allowed to kind of nest in communities are always more rooted in marginalized and communities of color. And so unfortunately, they're the ones that see the higher impact of poor air quality.
Gotcha. Greg, let's talk more kind of on a macro scale here. Now, Nevada counts only for about less than 1% of the total emissions in the U.S. That seems like a small amount. Now, we're looking whether we're talking about good or air quality. What kind of impact does our air then have on, let's say, the entire United States?
Right. I think if you look at Nevada's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, we are a relatively small amount. We actually are disproportionately lower greenhouse gas emissions compared to the rest of the states. Mainly that's because we don't have a heavy oil and gas extraction industry in this state. We also have benefited from the past several decades of lower emission standards for vehicles on the federal level. But there's a lot of work to do still. I think when Nevada joined the U.S. Climate Alliance to commit to the goals of the Paris Agreement, and also legislation this year to bring our emissions down to targets from 2005 levels, Nevada recognizes that we're going to have to take up the challenge and do our part to address climate change.
And Greg, let's talk more specifically about that and some of the things that have gone through state legislative policy recently. SB 254, which you just mentioned, one of the requirements there is that we have a greenhouse gas emissions report to be issued every year instead of every 4. First off, that report was just issued 2 weeks ago. What can that report tell us then about what the state of our air quality is in Nevada today?
Right. I think we have benefited over since 2005 from a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from our electricity generation sector. Nevada has taken advantage of the natural resources we have related to generating energy in a renewable fashion, and we've been aggressive in that. And I think, but now what we're looking at is increasing proportion of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from some other sectors, notably transportation. And one we haven't talked about a whole lot, there are ozone-depleting substitutes included in refrigeration that actually contribute hundreds to thousands of times their weight equivalent compared to carbon dioxide. So between transportation emissions and use of those hydrofluorocarbons, there's really a lot of work to be done.
Now let's talk about kind of what our projection is maybe over the next 25 years then. You mentioned that we have aligned ourselves with the Paris Agreement. We're looking at our goals being 28% below our 2005 levels by 2025 and then 45% below by 2030. When we're looking at kind of where we are and what we're projecting right now in this report, are we going to be able to meet those goals?
With existing policies, and some of those are up to question right now. For example, we are relying upon some of the lower emission vehicle standards that were passed in the past presidential administration that we're seeing the current administration want to change or roll back. And so since they aren't completely gone yet, we're assuming they're going to remain in place. We also have some assumptions about existing planned or anticipated coal-fired power plant retirements. And so those are kind of baked into our current projections. But even with those assumptions, we're still falling short of our goals by 4% in 2025 and I think by 16% in 2030.
And can we assume that with the presence of electric vehicles on the road, potentially in transportation and freight and things like that, but also in personal vehicles, and then also more renewable energy put into our system where we're not having fossil fuel burning energy, are we just going to see those numbers trend down, or do we need a lot more exact policy to be able to see that trend?
Our current projections predict with existing policies, predict a moderate decline in greenhouse gas emissions in transportation sector, but not enough to meet the goals that have been set out. So truly we are looking at more transformational change needed in order to meet those goals.
So then, Rita, let's talk more specifically about state policy here. What are some things, you've got your nose to the ground here at the Citizens Climate Lobby. Yeah. What are some of the big areas potentially that we could really reduce some of these levels?
Well, we're very fortunate to have a governor who has made attacking climate change a linchpin of his administration. And he is very supportive of methodologies that will help do that. He signed into law a requirement now that by 2030, 50% of our energy must come from renewable sources, and it will increase 2% per year up until 2030. Right now, there's about 32,000 jobs in renewable energy in Nevada, and it's expected that that will increase. So, I mean, people are concerned about jobs, and that is a very positive thing. He also took a bold step in signing Nevada onto a coalition with 22 other states that have committed to combating climate change in their own states, in spite of what may happen on a federal level. So there is definitely action in that arena. He also has charged his staff and others in the state to work together with environmental organizations, tribal governments, and so forth, to come up with a set of recommendations by December of 2020 for how the state can reduce energy consumption and reduce greenhouse gases and help to achieve the goals that Greg has talked about in the report.
Now, December 2020, so that is on the eve of our next legislative session that'll happen at the beginning of 2021. Let's talk about then our state legislation, Patrick. We are going to have open seats in our 2020 election, and for those that are going to be campaigning, what are some of the for the voters here, voter information, what are some of the policies or platforms we really should be looking at as our state legislators are campaigning?
Well, I believe that 2020 is going to go down in history as the climate election. We are now experiencing climate change at such a dramatically accelerated rate that people can't ignore it anymore. It's affecting people's everyday lives. And so I believe that only candidates with bold climate policies are going to be able to make it through the election. And so at the legislative level, I think we're certainly looking at increasing that renewable portfolio standard that Rita mentioned to 100%. There's no reason that we shouldn't be doing that really as soon as humanly possible. And then I think the climate action items that were in the report that Greg mentioned, there's a whole menu there of bold climate action that we could be taking right away in order to facilitate our transition off of fossil fuels. And I think that's the type of energy that voters are going to be looking for, is bold action as soon as possible, because we are in a crisis.
Yes. Yeah.
Jack, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I would agree with Patrick that with my role in community organizing, the biggest overall consensus that we're seeing when we're talking to community members, frontline communities, and especially the youth that we're organizing around, is that the plans and the policies that are being put forth are not urgent enough and are not really meeting the level and the scale of the climate crisis. And so, like Patrick said, the candidates that are running need to be bold and really tackle what's already facing our state right now with a little bit more urgency and a more aggressive timeline.
Let's move on to the federal government here. Let's talk about the House and the Senate record first, Rita. We have had right now in our congressional session, we have more than 50 bills that are tackling climate change in some way. A number of those are focused on emissions. Few have been successful. For one thing, prior to the 2020 election, do you see any legislation going through, particularly for clean air?
Well, I can speak about what's happening on the federal level because it is definitely of interest and is being watched, which I think will have an influence here in our state, especially since our two senators, Catherine Cortez Masto and Jackie Rosen, are both strong proponents of battling climate change. In the House, there is a bill, H.R. 763, that has bipartisan support. There are about 74 House members who have signed on as co-sponsors. And there is a similar bill that is in the Senate, which, of course, that's also bipartisan, but it's languishing because no action is being taken. The House bill is the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, which will place a fee, not a tax, because a tax implies that the money goes into the Treasury to be used as people see fit or as the government sees fit. The dividend part is these fees that are collected at the source where carbon is being produced, the wellhead, the mine, for example. Those fees will escalate over time, and the money that's collected will be distributed equally to American households. That's why it's called a dividend, not a tax. Now, it is only one idea in a whole toolbox of things that could and should be done. And I believe that, and I agree with Patrick, 2020 will be the year when climate change is seriously attacked on a federal level. So there are already things sitting there that can actually become law when we have people in the administration who agree that that is what needs to happen. And voters can get more information about the Energy Information and Carbon Dividend Act. There is a website that is available, and they can also get more information about what it does for America and for Nevada on citizensclimatelobby.org.
Gotcha. And you mentioned bipartisan support. How strong is that bipartisan support? Does it look like this is actually going to go through?
In the House, the majority of support right now is from Democrats, although there are a substantial number of Republicans. The immediate number does not come to mind now, who are supporting it. And in the Senate, the bill that is proposed there was proposed by both a Democrat and a Republican, but it's just sitting there at this point. So we hope that action will be taken after the election.
Gotcha. Jackie, there's a lot of research out there that's saying that more of the conservatives are starting to understand that climate change is something that needs to be addressed. But there's a lot of partisan differences. There's still a lot of voting behavior that has not changed. Are you seeing, especially when your boots on the ground, when you're dealing with the general public, are you seeing a change on the conservative side, especially with younger voters, towards more of these climate policies?
I think so. I think with the youth in organizing the community, it's kind of less of the rhetoric of like Republican versus Democrat. It's more kind of really rallying around that clean air and clean water is a universal thing, that it should not be a bipartisan issue. And so kind of really trying to get to the root of what do people call their environment, whether it's their school or their work or outdoor spaces, and how people should be treated, whether it's the air they breathe in there and the water that they're drinking, what we all deserve as far as climate justice in that respect. So it's not necessarily conservative or progressive, it's we all deserve clean air and water, wherever you call your environment. And I think the youth are really rallying around that.
Patrick, let's talk more just about potential bipartisan legislation that could go through. And I want to go back to that we are upcoming elections here in 2020, and our congressional seats are going to be up. So I ask you a similar question to on the state side. When we are looking as voters at how our candidates are campaigning, what are some of the policies or platforms that you think we really should be focusing in on?
Well, I think we have this movement of our mostly Democratic delegation toward pursuing climate action on the federal level. At the same time, it's juxtaposed with this current proposal, which many people may have heard of, the Clark County Lands Bill, which would dramatically expand the city of the urban core of Clark County. Indeed, it would cause permitting that would allow for the expansion of almost 300,000 acres of development in this county, which would double the size of Las Vegas. And the federal delegation really stands at a crossroads right now. Because doubling the size of Las Vegas is going to potentially double our vehicle miles traveled, which would really increase emissions, air pollution and carbon emissions. And so the federal delegation really has some decisions to make as to whether they're going to pursue this plan as it stands now and allow this city to double in size and the pollution that goes along with that, or whether we can pursue progressive policies, and I don't mean politically progressive, I mean environmentally progressive, to infill develop this valley, to reduce vehicle miles traveled, increase public transit, And, I think voters are going to be looking to that come this November as to whether there's consistency between national messaging and how the federal delegation makes decisions about land use right here in Southern Nevada.
And using that as a perfect example, whether we're talking about the federal side or the state side here, or a county level side, we're dealing with economic drivers, obviously, that are involved in expanding this. That is definitely more of a conservative focused area when we're talking even about climate change. Are there ways, are there compromises where we can find a middle ground where something like this can lead to some level of expansion, but yet still be contained enough where we can still meet where our goals are in air quality?
We have done an analysis that shows there's 100,000 acres of undeveloped land right in the Las Vegas Valley. And I think people know that. You drive around the valley, there's empty parcels all over the place. So we need to form tax incentives and other policies to promote infill development and developing all those parcels. In the majority of those, they're privately held, and speculators are simply holding onto the land until it achieves maximum return for their value. Well, maybe there is a broader societal good in having those parcels developed that perhaps trumps the need for speculators to make money off those parcels. So I think the point is there is very much a way that we can continue Las Vegas's population growth and economic growth without geographic growth.
Yeah, you're right, Patrick, and I want to add to that.
Correct,
I think
please.
we can learn from how we address the traditional criteria pollutants since the 70s and the 80s throughout this country. We've divorced environmental protection from economic growth, from population growth. And although we don't have the exact path laid out, I think we can, look back at that and think, we didn't know how we were going to get here, but we did. We've improved air quality quite a bit since the 60s and 70s. And so, we can take credit for that, but now we have a lot more work to do.
Gotcha.
I did some research few years back about infill and found that there were a tremendous number of barriers to developers, builders, to do infill. I don't know the current status of that, but that certainly has prohibited as much infill development as could and should occur. So it needs to be made more feasible for builders, developers, so that we don't have to sprawl.
So, Patrick, we're running out of time. I want to quickly transition to some of the presidential candidacies also. First off, President Trump, he's led, a lot of his policy has been around deregulation. As a matter of fact, there's been 90 environmental protection regulations that have been deregulated or in the process of being deregulated. Do we expect to see any change in his policy moving forward, either now up to the election or through his campaign cycle?
Look, I'm not going to mince words. President Trump is doing the bidding of the oil and gas industry, the fossil fuel industry, and the mining industry across the board, systematically stripping away the environmental protections that give us clean air and clean water and food to eat. And so I think we should expect more of the same from this administration, and really our only hope in reversing that is getting candidates into office who promote environmental protection and will reverse some of these disastrous policies.
And Rita, let's talk specifically then about some of the Democratic presidential candidates that are out there. There are a lot of policies that are the same. The Paris Accord, which we mentioned, most policies advocate for us reintroducing and being part of the Paris Accord. Most candidates are propose 100% clean energy by mid-century, similar to what our state also is proposing. Is there anything that stands out for you, particularly in any of the specific policies or platforms that any of the presidential candidates are running right now?
I don't feel that any of the candidates have been vocal enough about dealing with the fossil fuel industry. Their platforms, as far as I can tell, are all pretty much pablum. They're very similar. They cite lofty goals, and I appreciate that, but I don't see a clear picture of how are we going to deal with the fossil fuel industry when we know fossil fuels are a chief contributor to our climate and what's happening with it. And the transportation sector, as Greg was talking about. And so I'd like to believe that once there is a Democratic candidate, that perhaps the plan will be fine-tuned and more specific. It's one of the reasons, however, that Citizens Climate Lobby is approving and supporting H.R. 763, because it's a gradual approach with a lot of impact that can turn the tide and can push fossil fuel industries to stop their polluting ways and instead turn to ways that more renewable energy can be used.
I think I might have a somewhat different opinion.
Yep.
My organization released a climate scorecard. The Center for Biological Diversity Action Fund released a climate scorecard recently, and we found 3 candidates had plans that were head and shoulders above the rest, and that was Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Tom Steyer, who had, we have a 10-point plan for the new president to enact upon reaching office, and they each reached 8 or higher of those numbers, whereas we had other candidates such as Joe Biden or Amy Klobuchar who were down in the 1 or 2 out of our 10-point plan. So we do see some substantive differences between the candidates and the boldness of their climate plans.
Gotcha. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but we very much appreciate all of you being here and the discussion. Thank you so much. And if you would like to learn more about any of the topics that we've covered today, always check out our website at vegaspbs.org/Nevada-Week. Also, you can find us on social media at Nevada Week. Thank you very much.